Holy Scriptures and our ancient Egyptian, ancient Ethiopian history and culture. All that is known is that it existed there at a period so remote that it is useless to attempt to measure by years the interval of time which has elapsed since it grew up and established itself in the minds of men, and that it is exceedingly doubtful if we shall ever have any very definite knowledge on this interesting point. This is Wallace Budge speaking of these ideas of the Egyptian belief in one God and the Egyptian ideas of the future life. But now here's where we're now going to begin to touch on the NETER. The NETER. It says, but though we know nothing about the period of the origin in Egypt of the belief in the existence of an almighty God, El Shaddai, who was one Ahadu, Yahweh Elohim, the inscriptions show us that this being was called by a name which was something like Neter, usually pronounced Neter. When we look into the Amharic dictionary, and we're going to look under the word NETER, and there's a very interesting definition, and there's a even more interesting connection with the Holy Scriptures when we begin to tie that part of the story into our evidence. But first, let's look under NETER. NETER, verb transitive, it means bounced, as in a ball bounce, or it means refined, and it can also mean or reflect refined. So the idea of NETER from the Royal Amharic means bounced, as a ball or a black dot bouncing, as well as refined by melting, example, gold being refined, or precious metals being refined. And this is coming from the source, the headwaters of the Nile. So we know that the Nile, the Egyptian civilization, was a colony of ancient Ethiopia, and the Egyptians referred to ancient Ethiopia as the land of the gods. So now if we go to that pure language that Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 9 and 10 points us to in connecting that particular pure language with Ethiopia, and we go to the language of the only King of Kings of Ethiopia, the conquering line of the tribe of Judah, we find that NETER has a very symbiotic relationship to the scientific and metaphysical concepts of true Egyptian religion. You see, a lot of people are confusing when they look at the pyramids, scrolls, and wall paintings. There's a lot of science and technology that is being revealed. The white man has begun to understand some of this, but he has not revealed that his new discoveries come from his better understanding of our ancient culture, especially in ancient Egypt, as well as the Asian or Oriental man has been studying this. And we'll find out that in past times, these peoples, the Europeans, as well as the Asians, all came into Egypt to study, to learn, just like the Greeks, to develop their language and their culture and civilization. But this is where other polytheistic or polytheistic ideas, this is where the bastardization of the pure Yahweh worship in ancient Egypt came into play. It's not from its root in Ethiopia. That's the ancientmost, the Zatepi, the first time, the pure culture, which they say it goes so far back in time that they can't even imagine how long it really is, much less have any way to definitively decide upon a date or times of this. But what's very clear, we can see when the Hyksos, we can see when other Indo-Europeans came from the east, just like it says in Genesis chapter 11, where it says about the plain of Shinar and the Tower of Babel, that ones came from the east. Well, this is very interesting, because the ones who came from the east were determined on building a tower, right? They came from the east. Now we know that in ancient China and in Indo-European countries, Polynesian countries, the dragon is a very important symbol. So we have the dragon as being their main symbol, which in the African Asian cultures going more towards the Nile River, the lion is an important symbol. But when we begin to study astrotheological studies, we get to see that the same constellation Draco in the east is the same as what we know as Judah, Leo. So either it's interpreted as Leo in Africa, Ethiopia, Egypt, or in the Far East, the same constellation is interpreted as Dracos, or the dragon. So Genesis chapter 11 tells us that once as they journeyed from the east, but then they put all the blame for the Tower of Babel on a black man named Nimrod. You notice that they always talk about how Nimrod built this tower, so forth and so on. And all of that is Jewish fables. All that is Talmudic, Babylonian, Talmudic, Jewish fables. Because if you just look at the story for a moment, Nimrod, if he came from Ethiopia, if he was a son of Cush, he must have came from the west in order to reach Iraq, the plain of Shinar, Babel, so forth and so on. But the Bible clearly says that as they journeyed from the east, so ones were coming from the east. So if you look at a map of Iraq, you will recognize two things. That Nimrod came from the west. He didn't come from the east. Before Nimrod came from the west, the others were coming from the east. And they was coming to the plains of Shinar to build the Tower of Babel. And we know that their religion depends on the reptilian influence, or the dragon, the Dracos influence, whom the Bible tells us is Satan, right? But then Nimrod coming from the west, or coming from Ethiopia and Africa, we know that the lion of Judah, for example, but the lion even in ancient Egypt and ancient Ethiopia was a symbol. You see, so there's a distortion in the interpretation of the truth, because you've been lied to, basically. But we're going to get into that point a little bit more at another time. We're kind of going off of our main point right here, which is to speak about the NETER. Because let's give a definition of the NETER from Royal Amharic. Definition of the NETER, or NETER, as a verb, meaning he or it bounce as a ball. It or he refined by melting gold. Then we have netari. Netari means bouncing. We have nitter, which is an adjective. Very interesting. Nitter is an adjective like netter, or N-E-T-E-R. It's an adjective, and it means refined. And we know that netter is used like netter hen. Netter hen is a particular type of a priest. Is a particular kind of a priest. When we look at the NETER and the Sutan names, and we have to go to another book right here. We have to go to this Egyptian language, Lessons in Egyptian Hieroglyphics, by the same Sir E.A. Wallace Budge. And let's find the page right here. Because we put this together, we don't expect that we're going to be able to put it all together right here, right now, but just to lay down some basic cornerstones, to lay this truth on a basic foundation, and then begin to expand on the different subject matters, or the subsets. So we're talking about NETER the hen. NETER the hen, Holy Scriptures, and our ancient Egyptian, ancient Ethiopian history and culture. All that is known is that it existed there at a period so remote that it is useless to attempt to measure by years the interval of time which has elapsed since it grew up and established itself in the minds of men, and that it is exceedingly doubtful if we shall ever have any very definite knowledge on this interesting point. This is Wallace Budge speaking of these ideas of the Egyptian belief in one God and the Egyptian ideas of the future life. But now here's where we're now going to begin to touch on the NETER. The NETER.